Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. Today's guest isn't an advocate, but instead a journalist who has delved deeply into advocacy work in a book about one of the signal civil rights battles of our times, same-sex marriage. Sasha Issenberg's book, The Engagement, is an authoritative account of the 25-year fight for marriage equality. Speaking personally, it's the most true-to-life record of contemporary advocacy work I've ever read. In his career as a political reporter, Sasha has been a correspondent for newspapers and magazines such as the Boston Globe and Bloomberg Businessweek, as well as specialist media including The Recount and The Monocle. His 2012 book, The Victory Lab, peered behind the scenes at political campaigns' use of data science, and his forthcoming book, The Lie Detectives, covers the struggle to combat disinformation. In this episode of the podcast, Sasha and I talked about how he approached the story of the fight for same-sex marriage, an issue that appeared on the national political agenda quite suddenly in the 1990s. We discussed the journalistic challenge of tracing the strategic choices and calculations of advocates on both sides of the debate. Sasha recounted marriage proponents' key messaging shift from a relatively dry and clinical argument for legal protections to a warmer, more emotionally salient case for recognizing two people's lifelong commitment to each other. And with a keen journalist's eye, Sasha offered insights about basic questions of advocacy, such as pushing issues state by state versus nationally, the key differences between litigation and political battles, and how different kinds of personalities play into advocates' roles and approaches. I'm especially excited about today's episode because it combines my work passion of advocacy and organizing, as all episodes do, combined with my taste in reading. I read a lot of books by journalists, and for me, the ability to weave together compelling narrative nonfiction out of a complicated story is truly a superpower, something that I am in awe of. And today's guest, Sasha Issenberg, has written an authoritative book about the 25-year battle for same-sex marriage and marriage equality. And I want to say here at the outset, this is the best thorough depiction of how advocacy work is done that I've come across. And I think it'll give us a great angle on the podcast's subject. So welcome, Sasha, and apologies if I'm embarrassing you.
Thank you, David. I'm really glad to be here.
So that's where I wanted to start today, with your relation to the subject, not just the substantive issue of LGBTQ rights, but writing about the people pushing for them. Are there special sensibilities, insights, experiences, or curiosity that a writer like yourself brings when writing about advocacy and organizing efforts? Is there anything that, in your own background that you related to that you drew on?
I didn't have a personal connection to the topic. I'd been a political reporter during a period when same-sex marriage was, I think probably the most divisive cultural social issue in the United States. It had been something that had sort of floated around me, but not something I'd written a real word about ever as a newspaper reporter, magazine writer, and editor. The thing that really ultimately, I think, shaped my approach to this was having read a lot of the big books about the civil rights movement that were written primarily by journalists starting in the mid to late 70s. I think about Dave Garrow and Taylor Branch and Tony Lucas, and those are books I started reading in high school, college, that were perhaps grandiosely sort of the model or inspiration for what I was trying to accomplish here. These were basically journalists using a journalist toolkit to put together what was the first effort to make sense of the movement for racial equality, especially in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Dick Kluger, one other person I forgot to mention in that sequence. But those were the books that I had in mind as I started this, and helped shape the way that I thought about what I wanted to accomplish, and that requires, understanding the strategies and tactics of the people you're writing about, but also understanding the values and opinions that people on all sides of this debate had. And one thing that is really, a core part of the story about marriage here is how people change their opinions, and thinking about um, this was a new question to basically everybody that got engulfed in this conflict starting in the 1990s. And I wanted to bring to it the sort of the sense of unshapedness that existed around the political and legal conflict in the early days. And I think there's just a certain, open-mindedness that hopefully good journalists have to try to inhabit the minds of people, not just who might disagree with you, but also what might be the harder thing to imagine is people who didn't really have a formed opinion on this. And that's, I think, the thing that presentism often makes it difficult to understand. Like, people just didn't think about the question of should the law recognize a marriage between two men and two women on equal terms. Until the mid 90s, that was not a question anybody in the United States had been seriously asked, and or hardly anyone. And so that was one of the sort of, it's not what we think of as kind of traditional political empathy, but it does require thinking about people in their time and place in a way that sometimes becomes difficult.
Thanks for highlighting that. I think that is a key point, both about the story and the way that you cover it, that uh, you are watching an issue starting out being utterly absent from the agenda and any serious consideration. And we get to, as we follow the story, watch it ripen and become salient. So you mentioned the perspectives from um, from the different sides of the issue. And one of the other things that's impressive about your account is that it it gives a full picture of the strategy, tactics, deliberations, and work of marriage equality's opponents. And I wondered whether that posed any challenges. Was it any harder to get the source material for that, or get cooperation with that?
Yes. This was something that was really important for me as I got started. Was uh, it, it's I think actually a huge absence in a lot of the literature around the gay rights movement. Is that it tends to be written by folks who are of or attached to the gay rights side of the debate, who quite reasonably do not really have a lot of have trouble identifying with their opponents, and end up as a consequence, I think, tending to write them out of the story entirely. And so you get this kind of faceless foil of, here are the anti-gay forces, and the protagonists are those seeking to change the laws to be more accepting. And I certainly understand that as a worldview. It's a can be a terrible way about writing about political and legal conflict, which are just fundamentally adversarial. And so you can read books about aspects of the gay rights movement that, hand wave past their opponents in a paragraph without ever, I think, trying to seriously interrogate not just how and why they believe what they believe, but how and why they act the way they act and made the decisions they made. And for me, I wanted to capture the sort of duality of this conflict, because each side is constantly adjusting its strategy, tactics, priorities in response to either what the other side's doing or what it perceives or anticipates the other side is doing or will do. And you can't understand, and at crucial moments, it ends up being opponents of same-sex marriage who end up inadvertently setting the priorities of the gay rights movement, and vice versa to some degree. And so that was really important to me. But you're right to ask whether it was more difficult. I've never really covered sports, but I could imagine a scenario where a reporter after a game goes into two locker rooms, and the winners want to talk a lot, and the losers don't particularly want to talk about what just happened. And for most of the time I was working on this story, it was sort of pretty clear who was uh, triumphant. And um, what ended up happening was not just that folks on the losing side didn't particularly want to reflect on their failures, but there were a lot of people who, by the time I started writing about this in 2012, wanted to completely erase or disassociate themselves with the work that they had done opposing same-sex marriage.
Mm.
It had become so taboo, I think, in what had been a mainstream position in American politics for decades, held by presidents and senators and CEOs, that we shouldn't change marriage laws out of deference to tradition, had become stigmatized in so many circles that I think a lot of people hope that the world would not be reminded of what they had done on the one side of this issue. An example comes up. There's a guy named Matt Daniels who shows up in the narrative in the early 2000s as the head of a group called the Alliance for Marriage, and he is this sort of handsome young Ivy League educated guy who is not overtly religious, which is a sort of novelty for a cause that had been owned at various points by the Mormons, the Catholics, evangelicals, but by figures who came out of ministry or did explicitly religious advocacy. And Daniels had this sort of ecumenical sensibility. He was telegenic and didn't come off as like mean-spiritedly anti-gay in the way that some other people have been involved in this was. And he got a lot of media attention for being the kind of bright, friendly new face of anti-gay politics. He was profiled on the...
That rings a bell with some recent political developments in the House of Representatives.
That's exactly right. And so I think it's sort of similar to some of the things we're seeing about the new House Speaker. And was for a guy running a relatively small advocacy organization, got a lot of attention. He was profiled in The Atlantic. He was profiled on the front page of USA Today. He went on national TV. He seemed to really relish the personal spotlight. And as I tried to reconstruct, and he plays a crucial role in getting the idea of a federal marriage amendment in front of Congress in 2000, especially around 2003. So I knew he was a sort of pivotal character for me in understanding that story. And I found all sorts of press clips about him in this 2001 to 2005, 2006 period. And I went out to try to find him so that I could interview him. And Google is just sort of like not helping me. And his name is Matthew Daniels, which is not one of the great Googleable names of all time. But he just like has disappeared. This guy who had this very high profile and was sort of the next big thing in conservative politics was just like gone from public life. And eventually I found somebody to think, an international affairs think tank in DC with that name. Same lined up, the same academic credentials, found a picture. It was like clearly him. His professional bio does not mention that for 5 years he led this important advocacy organization that was shaping one side of what was the highest profile domestic debate in American life at that point. The guy just clearly wanted to act like it never happened. And I found, on a simple level, sending out emails to people who played crucial roles as litigators, as activists, as politicians, that, my response rate was much higher among the people who had been involved in fighting for marriage equality than those who had opposed it.
I want to capture a few interesting points there. One is that you it sounds like you observed a real contrast between, so during the fight, any advocate, worth their salt, is going to be very mindful of the opposition, right? I mean, counter advocacy is a, a pretty core idea to the work, um, but you're observing that in the story told afterwards, they sort of fade away, which is too bad, not just from a historical accuracy and journalistic perspective, but also because, as you say, when you are advocating, you are responding, adjusting. The other thing that I wanted to note is it very much comes through in your account that over time, the anti marriage equality perspective looks uglier and uglier. Right? It kind of starts to uh, just not be comfortable. If I'm right in what I read, some of that hesitance could be observed even a little bit earlier in the congressional discussions of what to.
What you did have in terms of tensions there were on the right. You had some tension that I think that there was a far stronger sort of constitutional conservatism that is largely lost now. People I think who did have sort of principled federalist views, who were torn over the idea of taking this area in which the federal government had long given significant leeway to states to set rules around marriage and imposing a federal standard on it. So I think you had a real ambivalence. Dick Armey was opposed to a federal marriage amendment because he really was a believer in, states' rights to constrain the federal government. So you did have people. I mean, that's one of the one. And on the left, at the same time, you had the emergence of this third side in the debate, the civil unions, as a kind of, what was seen as a viable policy substitute for marriage, and in strategic terms, a sort of safe compromise position. And so you had this sort of three-sided conflict within each party's coalition that gave refuge for people who didn't want to be to not be aggressive in advocacy for either side and take what they thought of as a sort of softer position. What I think gets lost with history with the passage of time is that I think in retrospect, there's a lot of talk about, we see this a lot with Obama. When did he change his mind on marriage? As though the two sides of the issue were, are you opposed to same-sex marriage rights or support same-sex marriage rights? In fact, at like many crucial moments, that might have been the sort of layperson's version of the policy consequences. But for policymakers, the question was usually, should this be decided by the courts or by the political process? Should this be decided at the state level or the federal level? Should this be decided by statute or by constitutional requirement? And those are sort of process questions that don't get translated well to the citizenry, but policymakers were usually deciding at that level. And I think that's a lot of people, I think, were having a debate about those process questions that got sort of publicly interpreted as taking a position on the are you accepting of gay families, and I think some people sort of got caught up in the wrong gears of that.
we'll hold that thought because the question of the political arena versus litigating in the courts is crucially important, and we're reminded how important that is with in the post-Roe world around reproductive freedom. But before coming to that, I think there's an interesting related issue. There's a narrative arc in the book about messaging where earlier on, as you say, sort of coming to the issue new or introducing the issue new into the arena, that the approach was taken sort of a classical civil rights protected class, and literally about equality. And then eventually there's a shift towards the frame of the aspirations, the relatable aspirations, really, for a monogamous household, right? The idea that that LGBTQ people, want what everyone wants. Although your book also notes that that there are parts of the advocacy community are ambivalent about that, not feeling like sort of hewing to the social mainstream. Could you talk for a bit about that evolution of the messaging strategy?
Yeah, I mean, for the first, this basically emerges as an issue in the early 90s, and through the mid 2000s, late 2000s, basically every time that there is a political conflict, it is downstream from a piece of litigation. So I tell a story of this case in Hawaii, and then this case in Vermont that sort of builds on some of the lessons from Hawaii, and then in Massachusetts, which is the first time that a court rules or actually enacts equal marriage rights for same-sex couples at a court order. In each of those cases, what has happened is a lawyer representing some number of same-sex couples goes and sues under the state constitution and claims that they were discriminated against. And there are quirks in each of those states' constitutions that gives them a point of entry. But in each case, the lawyer has to go in and itemize the legal injustice that is befallen his or her clients. And so I have the number in the book, I forget it, but in the lawyer in Hawaii, this guy Dan Foley, who mounts the first successful marriage case in history, is sitting there with his clerk or intern or whatever he had, assistant paralegal, going through the state code to identify every single place that Hawaii law treats married couples differently than unmarried couples, right? So, if you get a discounted entry to the state national parks or something, that and gay people can't get that, but straight people can, that was a potential harm. And they find hundreds of these instances throughout the tax code, throughout everything. And they take that to court. They win in court, the legislature gets involved, which becomes a fairly typical thing, and they have to end up fighting this at the ballot when opponents of same-sex marriage try to write a ban into the state constitution. And the campaign that ends up fighting this for the votes of Hawaii voters ends up basically inheriting the logic and rhetoric of the court case. And so they're going to voters saying, hey, there are all these ways in which gay and lesbian couples are discriminated against. Let's show you this long list. And a lot of these are like things that, that pull pretty well in terms of things that heterosexuals, even if they're not like crazy about gay rights, think is kind of unjust to deny other people. The example we always heard was hospital visitation. You know, whatever you think of gays and lesbians, why shouldn't somebody be able to decide who they have in their hospital room when they're under treatment or worse? And so these cases use this legalistic logic. These campaigns use these legalistic logic that had been basically developed by lawyers to win in court, and then took it to voters. And what they eventually found was this stuff, even if it polled well, like nobody really disagreed with the hospital visitation thing, it was not emotionally salient. And the big messaging shift that I write about that happens after 2008, after the Prop 8 defeat in California, leads gay marriage advocates to the sort of conclusion that the other side has been using this really emotionally resonant messaging. You know, schools are teaching your kids that it's okay to be gay, says one side, and the other side is saying, you know, how could we dare discriminate on state national park entrance fees? Which ads are gonna, you know, move people who are deciding late about the risk of changing state law here? And so they embark on this sort of massive research project in 2009 and 10 that I documented, and it leads them to the place that what you described, David, which is that strip away all that talk about the legal consequences of the individual rights and benefits that are afforded by being married, and talk more about what marriage represents, which is, you know, this desire to enshrine one's commitment to another person for forever, to do it before your community, and the idea that that is a far more emotionally salient way to reach heterosexuals who might not might not know any gays or lesbians, even or think about their political project, but can you know, there's a lot of talk in that research about the golden rule, but this basic, like, why should other people be denied the thing that you have, without talking about it in legal terms, but talking about it in kind of, you know, universal moral terms, becomes this major shift that, and you see the difference between the campaigns that are run in 2008 and 2012. In 2008 in California, you know, the last ad before the Prop 8 vote was Dianne Feinstein, the state's one of the state senators, sitting in her home study saying, you know, we in California have a constitution that protects people. We shouldn't amend our constitution to hurt people. She doesn't even say the word gay. She doesn't even talk about gay families. She's, you know, and 4 years later, the messaging is about why marriage is important to everyone. And it is, one is cold and one is warm, and gays and lesbians were afraid of that kind of warm messaging earlier, because basically there was an assumption that straight people were weirded out to hear about gays and lesbians loving each other, and they started thinking about sex, and the movement eventually recognized that you have to talk about, you know, what these relationships are about and what drives them, or you're sort of messaging on uneven footing with your opposition.
That interplay between pursuing the issue in the courts and pursuing the issue in the political arena, and you mentioned states and state courts, quite the intricate dance between state courts and state legislatures, kind of after you, my dear Alphonse, which was interesting. But the bigger issue is about what's more durable, isn't it? Right? That the courts, there's a fragility that we now see with the overturning of Roe, to the courts, that if you can sort of root it in public sentiment, that's going to hold better. Yes?
Yes, and I think that there was So I think there's sort of two tiers to this. There's the question in states. Um, the fact is, it was impossible to imagine, even in the most liberal states in the country, politicians proactively granting equal marriage rights to gays and lesbians before, 2008, 2010. Even when this issue was coming up in Vermont, New York, California, um, Hawaii, take your pick of the most democratic, most liberal states in the country, politicians were not willing to go near this, or were, did it only when it was sort of forced by the courts. So there wasn't really a strategic path early on for gay marriage activists to even think about starting this with politicians. And I think that you had gay rights litigators, the ones who drove these cases in the 90s and 2000s. And that's both, gays and lesbians and people like the Dan Foley, the Hawaii lawyer I mentioned, who's a straight guy, but had done some gay rights cases. They had very much been sort of shaped by the Warren Court. And like many, I think, American liberals, lawyers, legal academics, and political figures, they had come to think of the courts as the great sort of grantors and guardians of equality when the political process wouldn't be. And there was a great optimism about courts. Now, in the case of gay rights, it was tempered by the fact that in 1986, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld state sodomy bans. So there was, by the 1990s, this feeling of federal courts are unkind to us because anything that could go to the Supreme Court is going to go to a court that has, whose current holding is that it's perfectly reasonable for states to criminalize gay activity. But they thought that in states that state courts would be more friendly than the political process. In those cases, I don't think that they were thinking about whether one was going to be more durable than the other. By the time that around 2010, there was a big rethinking of the national strategy for winning same-sex marriage rights in 50 states. And activists are starting to think about the conditions under which they can go to the Supreme Court. I read about there's one in 2005, one big summit, one in 2010. By 2010, they are thinking a lot about...
If I could fill in what you're referring to a little bit there, you would remember the numbers and I don't, but it was a strategy that essentially was about the political legal tipping point, right? We get so far in so many states, and then the assumption was the dominoes will fall.
Yeah, and so in 2005, they came up with this math. It was 10, 10, 10, 20. So the idea is what they had done was they looked at, the question was, what will it take for the Supreme Court to rule? Let's say we think we have the legal arguments and precedent on our side. What conditions will we need in the country for the Supreme Court to rule that same-sex couples have the right to marry? And they went back and looked at conditions in the country when Loving v. Virginia was decided in 1967, and the basic math
for interracial marriage,
right, that struck down state bans on interracial marriage. And they said, let's sort of replicate that math. What happened in that instance was that the Supreme Court basically saw its job as bringing outliers into a court that might have been ambivalent about imposing marriage rules on a majority of states, was willing to do it when it was 10 or 12, basically southern states that were outliers. What does that math look like for same-sex marriage? And they came up with this idea of how many states would need to, these sort of arbitrary benchmarks of how many states would need to have gotten to marriage rights on their own.
They're guessing.
They're guessing, but it's just a way of, they're guessing for donors. Basically say donors, hey, we have a plan, but they pulled the plan out of like thin air based on this, historical analogy. But by 5 years later, they realize that that's like untenable. So many states have passed these bans on same-sex marriage that there's no way you're going to get to 20 states that are going to legalize marriage. And so they need to come up with a different theory of how the Supreme Court is going to come around to something that's they need to manufacture basically a different benchmark that they can aim for in their campaigning that would make them think that it's safe to take this before the court. And they come up with the idea that, that getting a majority for marriage, that 50% public opinion support for marriage is important because, Anthony Kennedy, who at that point it's pretty clear will be the swing justice on a case like this. The idea is that, Supreme Court justices wake up and read the Washington Post over their cornflakes like everybody else does. And Anthony Kennedy's going to see a Gallup poll. And if the Gallup poll says that 46% of Americans support gay marriage, that might give him pause about imposing it on a lot of states that have already, through their own political and legal processes, said, no, this is not for us. But if it says 53% support it, that he might have a different view. And so you get this interesting...
That must have prompted the advocates to invest more seriously in public opinion research than most campaigns do.
Yes, and if you look at the priorities start to shift in 2012, 2013. Before, there'd been this pure focus on states where either progress is possible in the courts or through the political process, or where stopping the other side from basically passing a constitutional amendment was a priority. Because one thing is just to say, is remarkable and that drew me to this in the beginning is this is a 50-state fight where both sides, as we've talked about, can take place in the courts or legislatures or at the ballot box, sometimes through executive power, but where both sides are simultaneously on offense and defense. And so one of the important things that the gay rights movement and its funders have to do is decide they cannot compete in all 50 states simultaneously. It's a little bit like running an electoral college strategy if you're a presidential campaign. You're not campaigning at the same level in every state. You have to triage, right? So some states are definitely going to win. Some states your opponent's definitely going to win. And then you have to figure out, among the states in the middle, how much am I investing in them so that I'm not spread too thin, but am not also wasting resources in places that aren't really in play. And so that becomes a real important, as you get a national, especially the funders want to know, hey, are we focusing in the places where we can have an impact? Because we can't have an impact everywhere at the same time. But what happens when they start focusing on this national majority thing is, in 2012, they're spending money to move public opinion in Massachusetts, where marriage is legally secure in perpetuity, and in Mississippi, where there's no chance that there's going to be any movement, because moving public opinion from 70% support to 75% support in Massachusetts, or from 20% to 24% in Mississippi, is contributing to what they think of as the national polling number.
That's fascinating. So I'm speaking to you from Wisconsin, and I'll tell you what's happening in Wisconsin lines up exactly with their theory, which is that it's shifts in the Milwaukee suburbs that are taking place. Those suburbs aren't becoming majority Democratic. They're becoming smaller majority Republican. And so that same idea, if it all needs to add up, in this case, to broadest national public sentiment, then cutting into the extent of opposition in the reddest places is part of that.
Yeah, and this wasn't because you were going to get any actual political change out of it. They just wanted to reflect it in public opinion statistics.
You've talked about some of the characters in the book, and one of them enjoyed media attention. And you begin the book with one character, a community activist in Hawaii, the driving force behind their Pride celebration. And starting with him and then continuing, I was fascinated by how the light that you shined on the relationship between different types of personalities and the roles they played, their approaches to advocacy and organizing. So, if you could say a little bit about that, about the how personalities played into who was doing what and how.
Yeah, so this guy Bill Woods, basically is where we start the book, and he was the gay activist in Hawaii throughout the 70s, 80s. He was like many first generation activists in any sphere. He had to be incredibly entrepreneurial. You know, he started basically everything that the gay and lesbian community had in Hawaii. The community center. He had the first gay radio show. The gay newspaper he started. Um, he was a gadfly. He was like, a guy who defied, went out on his own, was not terribly good at working in coalition with others, was very good about starting things, not always good about bringing other people in to build a base of support. And that's probably exactly what the community needed in the 70s and 80s, when there were very few people who would stand up and associate with it, and he quite proudly would. The thing is, he was the story starts with him trying to put on a parade in 1989, and getting into this incredibly petty fight with the local Pride planning committee that does not want to put on a parade. And Woods decides he's going to go out on his own and put on a parade that's going to rival the vigil that the Pride planning committee puts on. Who's this Pride planning committee? This is like every bad planning committee experience somebody's had at their office for planning the Christmas party.
Church politics,
but with great national consequences. Ultimately, he decides he's going to do his own parade. And now he's looking just for ways to upstage the vigil, and comes up with the idea that he's going to do this Mooney-style mass wedding on the bandstand at the end of the parade route. And he's not a lawyer. He pretty clearly misreads the state's marriage statute and comes away with the idea that actually, if these couples get married on stage, maybe the state will have to recognize them. And gets into a fight with the state affiliate of the ACLU when they don't want anything to do with this, because they think it's sort of a poor legal theory and not particularly good politics. And he drives ahead and then ends up mostly driven by spite against the ACLU for not respecting him enough. Decides that he's going to put on this PR stunt on December 17th, 1990, where he leads 3 couples into the Honolulu office of the Hawaii Department of Public Health to request marriage licenses. And then marches the couples a few blocks to the ACLU office and demands help. And he has gotten basically the entirety of the Honolulu press corps to follow this. And he had no plan for what's next. It was like all tactics. There was no strategy. There was a faulty reading of the law. And a month later, these couples get handed to Dan Foley, the civil rights attorney I mentioned, who takes their case without great hopes for success. And a bunch of wild things sort of fall into place for them, and they end up getting the Hawaii Supreme Court becomes the first court on earth in May of 1993 to rule that the fundamental right to marriage could apply to same-sex couples. And you need to understand the kind of petty persistence, tactical genius, and strategic ineptitude of Bill Woods to understand how that historical change got set into motion. And because nobody, when I started this book, probably because I was shaped by having read some of those big books about the civil rights movement, I kept on thinking I would find that you read Dick Kluger's book, Simple Justice, about the Brown v. Board case. And a big part of the early section of it is, 40 years before the school cases get to the Supreme Court, that the recently founded NAACP is developing a legal strategy to dismantle Jim Crow, that maps out a sort of ladder of cases to build precedents that you could eventually get to getting the court to rule on the segregation of neighborhood public schools, right? And start Howard University Law School is open basically with the express goal of training African American lawyers to mount this sort of deliberate, incremental set of cases that they decide they're going to go through professional schools and then go through graduate schools and then
I think I've read this book.
It's great. It's amazing. And if there's a takeaway from it from a sort of legal advocacy perspective, it is about the long, slow, deliberate, controlled work that Thurgood Marshall most famously, but Constance Baker Motley and other lawyers did to build these precedents so that they could end up going to the court with a strong foundation for the big case. And when I started this project, on marriage 11 years ago, knowing very little about the history, I assumed that the kind of holy grail of my reporting was to find the origins of this big national strategy and plan. That
surely there was a master plan,
and there wasn't. The only reason that this ends up being kind of introduced to our politics as an issue, first in Honolulu and then in Washington and then in a bunch of other state capitals, is because this gadfly activist who kept on fighting with people in Hawaii over really small personal stuff, decided to keep pushing without knowing what would happen. And there was a huge motivation, after the court rules, to everybody's surprise, in May of '93, that in favor of the plaintiffs, Lambda Legal, which is the at the time and remains the sort of dominant LGBT public interest litigation firm, decides, comes in as and offers itself as co-counsel, which basically means that they'll put a bunch of money into the case that and help with things like depositions of experts on the mainland that the lawyer in Hawaii can't do on his own. And so Lambda Legal starts raising money nationally around this case. It's we won this huge landmark victory. We stand on the precipice of, we need one more court to rule, and we stand on the precipice of a state legalizing marriage for same-sex couples. It becomes a big project for Lambda Legal throughout the 90s. In telling the story, if you look at the Lambda Legal, the materials that they put out, trying to draw interest and raise money for this case, it's 3 couples went into the Department of Public Health to request marriage licenses and stand up for their rights. They're now represented by this great civil rights attorney who's been successful in the lower courts and at the state Supreme Court. Bill Woods doesn't exist. Bill Woods has been written out of the story because he's incredibly inconvenient for the kind of professional advocates who come to this later, because he's catalyzed this whole thing, making all the wrong calculations from an advocacy perspective. He didn't lay the groundwork he didn't have a legal strategy. He didn't have he didn't even know what the legal cause was going to be. He had not laid any of the groundwork politically or with the attorney general who was going to litigate this. He did everything wrong and ended up getting the right outcome. And so there's the
tension between boldness and caution is a very clear strand in how you lay out the history. is that maybe a creative tension? Is that actually um, the interplay and dynamic between those two, sort of a complementarity, and you need both?
Yeah, and look, I think that there are times where people were bold and it misfired, and there are times where people were cautious and probably in retrospect didn't need to be. An example of it, Bill Woods is a sort of tragic hero that sets in motion. We would not have had the Obergefell decision by the Supreme Court in 2015 if it had not been for Bill Woods starting this ball in motion in Hawaii in 1990. And some of this is like the butterfly flapping its wings in China,
Right.
way of thinking about history, but this was not a live political issue until the courts in Hawaii validated it as one. And and so he plays this instrumental role, but you see this other periods where people are bold and it is foolhardy. So, I write after California votes in 2008 in Proposition 8 to ban same-sex marriage in the state constitution. Ted Olson and David Boies, who had faced off against each other in Bush v. Gore in 2000, decide that they are going to sue the state of California, claiming that it violates the U.S. Constitution to discriminate against same-sex couples. And they structure their case in every way to get to the U.S. Supreme Court as quickly as possible, with the goal of setting up a question before the judges which would compel all 50 states to recognize same-sex couples. At the point they file the case, I think 4 or 5 states have legalized same-sex marriage. And this get coverage of these guys is this heroic. They're standing up. They're going to the Supreme Court to fight for the rights of a disadvantaged minority, which is true. But the people who are critical of it are Lambda Legal, the ACLU, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, the people who actually do gay rights litigation, who say this is poorly timed, poorly chosen, and unlike political conflicts, there are a lot of political conflicts where you can initiate conflict and you fail and you're no worse off for having done it, and sometimes better. So you introduce a bill in, I don't know, from a left-leaning perspective, there are activists who push the Green New Deal. They introduced it in Congress. They never got full votes on the legislation. It's not going anywhere. They might be better off for having raised the awareness of this and using it as a moment for public education. They're certainly no worse off. One of the things that, in retrospect, advantaged gay rights litigators was that federal courts had barely ruled on the question of recognizing same-sex families. And so there was a void that Anthony Kennedy could come into and shape a new jurisprudence around without having to overturn existing precedents. The risk of Boies and Olson going to the Supreme Court early would be that the court could rule against them. And what we ended up seeing when the court did rule on the Prop 8 case in 2013 was they overturned Prop 8 basically on a technicality, but they clearly were not ready to go as far as they wanted. And it would have been a total disaster if for the gay rights movement, if that case had gotten to the court the way it did without having the sort of technicality escape. And that's a place where the boldness was incredibly risky and would have been dangerous to the movement. And so, yeah, that tension's always there. And it's a tension about strategy, and it's also a tension about actual policy outcomes. I mean, I think for a lot of politicians, Democratic politicians, including Joe Biden and Barack Obama, the Clintons, John Kerry, supporting civil unions was the responsibly cautious thing to do because, hey, we could get some incremental progress and not awaken the backlash that we would get if we were pushing marriage proposals in front of a public that wasn't ready for them.
Before we go, I want to ask a question about the note on which the book ends. It's sort of an intersectionality question, if intersectionality is about sort of everybody progressing together, you conclude with the sort of the unfinished business of trans people's rights. So I wanted to get your thoughts about how marriage equality successes relate to that ongoing struggle, after the successes were achieved.
Yeah. So, we've talked a lot about the choices that advocates made or decided not to make.
The battles we pick, as it were.
It's worth thinking that these battles take place on a landscape. And that is a landscape that is shaped by big political shifts, by views on social cultural questions, structure of society. But one of the ones that's really important in the gay rights question is scientific views about heredity, innateness. And it is, I went back and read a lot of media coverage from the 1990s as part of my research for this. Every time Time or Newsweek wrote about a gay rights question or homosexuality in the 1990s, like the fifth paragraph of the article would always be like, to be sure, experts are unclear whether homosexuality is a matter of nature or nurture. Like that was a core part of, when people now, if you describe homosexuality as a lifestyle choice, that is seen as pejorative. In the 1990s, gay rights supporters would say things like, we need to be more respectful of other people's lifestyles. What has changed is that there is a, downstream from a bunch of genetic research to just the popular understanding of lay people is a radical shift in the way we think about what we're born with versus what we choose over our lifetimes. This has changed not just the way we talk about sexual orientation, the way we talk about addiction, the way we talk about temper, the way we talk about a whole bunch of behavioral traits. It is just widely accepted that we have a lot of that we are shaped by genetics and in a way that was not understood 30 years ago. And if you look at polling on the question of basically, do you think people, are born gay or choose to be gay, there's been a dramatic shift. And a lot of the messaging questions we talked about, the questions about what does acceptance look like, what does equality look like, is predicated on this question of, people are not, so much of the opposition to same-sex marriage, which sounds crazy to our ears now. People were making a serious claim that you might incentivize in the 90s and 2000s, that you could incentivize young people to want to be gay if you let them marry. Like, this was actually said by, like, serious people.
It's such a great deal. Right?
and that's just not a viable worldview in any way now. And so I think I suspect that we will have that our views, our understanding of sexual identity will mature, transform in the coming decades based on a more sophisticated understanding of the science of gender that we do not have now, and we cannot fully anticipate both what will be discovered and how that information will sort of filter down to non-scientist lay people. But I have to assume that the sort of landscape of the assumptions that your average voter, average juror will have about how and why trans people are trans will be very different 10 or 20 years from now.
Thank you so much for this. This was great. I was really looking forward to it, and appreciate your taking the time to speak with me.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for your thoughtful questions. I've enjoyed this discussion.